Well, welcome everybody. My name is Shayna Lang. I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for Pathways to Inclusive Higher Education. And I'll share a little bit more about what we do and kind of what our hope is for Colorado and students with disabilities in general. But is a small nonprofit. So we have our executive director and then myself. We have our contact information on the screen for you because we really want to be a resource to you. Whether you're a prospective family with a student with an intellectual disability or a different kind of disability and you're curious about college options, if you're an educator, a special educator, a disability service provider, whatever world you fall into, we want to be able to offer you resources so that you feel equipped to help students with disabilities in your life pursue their college dreams and take the necessary next steps. So please feel free to reach out to me at any point. You have my work cell and my email there. And as I mentioned, I will be sending this in an email to you as well so that you can follow up. So who are we? We, as I mentioned, are a nonprofit, and we exist in the state of Colorado to help colleges and universities develop inclusive programs for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And within our vision for those programs and what we want to equip universities and colleges to do is to create programs that offer academic growth, social development, career advancement, and independence for that population of students. I always make a note that is this nonprofit that really works to raise awareness about inclusive higher education across the state, to equip colleges, equip teachers, but we do not offer the direct supports on the campuses. So I'll share about what our college campuses are here in Colorado, and they all have program staff that specifically serve students in those arenas. But we are really here to introduce families and students to that option and hopefully get them connected if it's the best fit for them. So with our next hour, we have 3 objectives that we really want to tackle. First, I want to help you understand what is the role of disability services in higher education and how would a student access those. And then we're going to jump into really our wheelhouse, which is discussing what is inclusive higher education. How is that different than disability services? And how is it that it's beyond compliant, meaning how does it go above and beyond what traditional disability services would offer? And then towards the end, I want to help you guys be able to identify which services you or the students you serve would require. Is disability services the route they want to take, or do they need additional support such as inclusive services? And then we'll talk through, if we have some time, some of those preparation strategies just to start implementing early on. So I love this timeline. I think it gives a good picture, especially when we are looking at disability services, what is required at all institutions of higher ed, versus inclusive services, which is fairly new to Colorado, and just to look at the timeline of laws and how this has really evolved over time in Colorado. So first, you'll see in 1973, that's when Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act passed. That is mandated for all institutions of higher education, saying that they cannot discriminate against students that meet their entry criteria. So essentially, if a student can be admitted, meet all the test requirements, meet the GPA requirements that's set in place by an institution, they cannot be discriminated against if they have a disability. So that is in place across all institutions of higher ed. And then we added on to that in 1990. This is where you hear ADA a lot. So the Section 2 of Americans with Disabilities Act, also required for all institutions of higher ed. This was put in place to make sure that not only are students not discriminated against when they have disabilities in higher ed, but that they have access to appropriate accommodations so that they can equally engage with their environment, with the content of each class, etc. So these are the 2 laws that really propel disability services. And we'll talk about what that looks like on college campuses. But these are all, as I said, mandated in place at any institution of higher ed. And then we're going to take a look at inclusive higher education and what were the laws that put that into motion. So it wasn't until 2008. So it's really new across the nation in a lot of ways. But the Federal Reauthorization of Higher Education Opportunity Act, this was at the national level, gave funding for select institutions to develop programs for students with intellectual disabilities. Traditionally, students that don't meet college entry criteria and wouldn't be able to access college content with just the disability services. So then they created this national resource hub called Think College, which is a wonderful resource center for all-inclusive higher education right now across the nation. So that launched in 2008. And then it wasn't until 2016 that Colorado came into that movement. And now we said, hey, we have students with intellectual disabilities that are graduating from K-12, completing their transition programs and feeling like they don't have more to do, even if they have things that they're really passionate about learning, if they have goals that they want to pursue. And so in 2016, we worked really hard to get Colorado Senate Bill 196, which launched 3 pilot schools here in Colorado. And those 3 schools are still going strong, which is exciting. And then most recently, we added another bill here in Colorado to expand those schools. We want to see more and more options across the entire state of Colorado for students with intellectual disabilities. So these 3 laws is really what we focus on as the propelling force for inclusive higher education services, specifically here in Colorado. And then I threw on at the end, in these upcoming years, we're going to be seeing 2 to 4 more colleges and universities open their doors to students with intellectual disabilities. As a result of that House bill in 2022, we have grant funding in place to start new programs. And we're really excited about that and is working with those new institutions to be able to meet the needs of our community with intellectual disabilities. So where I want to start, we're going to start with that first section. What is just the baseline expectation at disability services in higher education for any student that would meet college entry criteria? So the first, as I've mentioned, is that they're legally mandated at all institutions. So a lot of times at larger institutions, you're going to see an entire office, disability services office, with a coordinator, a director, multiple counselors that are there to help. For some of your smaller institutions or private institutions, it might just be one person or a few key personnel. But no matter what, it is a requirement that there's somebody at that institution that students with disabilities would go to receive accommodations and receive support. Those names of those offices or those personnel across institutions are going to differ. We've kind of seen it fluctuate over the years. Sometimes it's as simple as disability services, but now there's some change to access services, accessibility office, things like that. So you might have to be a little creative as you're digging through institutions to figure out which office is the best one to connect with. Students that access disability services must be admitted to the institution. And so therefore, they're going to be students that meet your traditional entry criteria. So they're going to be traditionally admitted and degree seeking. Those are the students that are able to be served at disability services. Disability services serve a wide variety of documented disabilities. So that it kind of goes back to that initial law where we can't discriminate against a particular individual or their diagnosis. And so we're seeing a lot of different types of students that come into this office for support. Could be a physical disability, chronic health, autism spectrum disorder, ADHD, mental health impairments, things like that. So it's all across the board. This office is kind of that one-stop shop to get some guidance. Students do have to meet, even when they're receiving disability services, they have to meet the essential functions or the standards of all the classes that they're taking and all of the standards of the programs around them. So what I mean by that is disability services cannot offer any limitation to expectations. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like in the classroom setting. But that's an expectation that when students come to receive accommodations, they know that they can't change the expectations of any degree path that they're pursuing or course that they're taking. So that's really important, and disability services staff is going to hold students to that expectation. They're only able to offer accommodations. So you're going to see accommodations in the classroom, in a testing environment, or maybe housing and campus access as well. So once a student is admitted to an institution, so they've met that criteria, they've been admitted, how do they actually get in contact or kind of follow the protocol of disability services? It's going to require self-advocacy on the front end. So students, a lot of times there's an online request form to set up a meeting with disability services or to fill out just kind of an initial inquiry about what are their needs, filling out basic information so that they can set up an appointment. It does require them to initiate. And I think a lot of times in my past, working with some students coming from special education services in K-12, they came to college assuming that they would almost be sought after to get this figured out, but that is not the case. Students have to initiate this contact with disability services and let them know that they have needs. And then they're going to start engaging in an interactive process. So this isn't a very quick exchange all the time. Students can start with a meeting with disability services, and then it's going to be interactive and ongoing. It's not just, I have this disability, give me these accommodations. They want to know the needs of the student. They want to explain the expectations of the college environment, make sure that they're connected to resources across the institution. So it's very interactive in an ideal world. That's not always the way that it goes, but it should be very interactive. So students in that process are going to self-disclose their disability. So students have to identify what their disability is and communicate with disability services what their needs are. Then they're going to be requested to provide documentation of that disability. This is going to be a little bit different across institutions, but essentially what we're looking for is clearly stated diagnoses. A lot of times students are coming from K-12 and they just kind of pass off an IEP and call it good. But sometimes IEPs are not very clear on what a key diagnosis is or what the academic needs are. Same thing with a 504. So those are not always automatically accepted as documentation. Schools have the right to ask for medical documentation or maybe early years of documentation saying, when was this initially diagnosed? This is just something that they're mandated to have in order to initiate accommodations for students. It's not always cumbersome. So very likely students can present a recent IEP and it would be good to go and they'll be able to move through that process. But I do note that sometimes it requires a bit more documentation. And then they're going to discuss their disability related needs or their educational needs with a disability service personnel. So the student, it's so important for them to know what are their needs in the classroom, what have they used in the past as accommodations that worked or didn't work, and talk through that with the disability services office. And then collectively, they're going to determine what we call appropriate accommodations. So those might look different. They're not going to just directly transfer from a 504 plan or an IEP. They might look pretty similar, but there's going to be some discussion on what's going to be appropriate at the college level. And then here's a big component. The institution will then give the student a new accommodation letter. So faculty and professors should never receive a 504 letter or an IEP. They don't know what to do with that. They've never heard about those. What they are going to be looking for is an accommodation letter approved by the institution, typically just a one-page document PDF. But that's something that's really important that students know that's going to come from the institution in order to be used in their classes. And then students are oftentimes, this is most often, they're the ones required to take that accommodation letter and provide it to their professors. It does not get sent to their professors on their behalf. They have to initiate that conversation and identify that they need accommodations in that class. That also can be an interactive process where they talk about what accommodations they need in that course, or it could be a really simple, here's my accommodation letter, please implement these. But there's a huge shift to the student's ownership of communicating these needs to their faculty and their staff at the higher education level. So a couple of things that are just important to note with this. As I mentioned, with an interactive process, there's a length of time that can be put in place before a student actually receives that formal accommodation letter. So it's important to start early, begin the process early, reach out to institutions, ask what it's like to get accommodations there, and just have a good understanding of how early you can start that in the summer before the first fall that your student would be pursuing higher ed. It's also going to be highly important for students to maintain open communication with the Disability Services Office. I've worked with lots of students that kind of feel like it's a one and done situation. But we have students with disabilities that fluctuate and their needs fluctuate and their courses fluctuate. And so they're always able to come back to disability services and say, hey, I'm not using this accommodation. Maybe we don't need it. Or I'm still really struggling to show what I'm learning. What's another accommodation we can pursue? So it can be ongoing, and we really encourage that. Continual advocacy for approved accommodations. What I mean by this is that students are going to have to continue each semester to provide that accommodation letter to their new professors. It's not something that just gets carried over to the next teacher like we see in K-12. Instead, students have to take ownership each semester, meet with those professors, communicate their needs. And then they're also going to have to follow some accommodation procedures. So a lot of time when we're looking at extended time on exams, or maybe some particular accommodation on an assignment, students have to be able to request that in advance so that there's space for them at the testing center if they're taking it with extended time, or they have to communicate with their professor in advance that they're going to use the testing center. So it requires some ownership and initiative for students. So as I mentioned, testing center requests and communicating in advance. So all of this, as we've talked about, is really from that baseline. What are the essential requirements of higher education institutions? And so it's important for us to see that even in all this regulation, these disability services that are being offered, that there are rights and responsibilities for students to know about, as well as for our faculty, professors, and staff. So I just want to break that down a bit. I'm not going to go into too much depth on this. There are some resources online that can really break it down in more of a visual way, but just to hit on this really quickly, students that are traditionally admitted accessing disability services, they have the right to have confidentiality of their diagnosis. So once they receive that accommodation letter, it is not going to list their diagnosis on there. It is simply stating what they need in the classroom or what they need in the college environment. So it's up to them to share that information with faculty if they want to, but that's something that is confidential. They have the right to equal treatment, meaning that they're going to get graded just like any other student would. They have the right of choice if they want to use their approved accommodations. They don't have to. They don't have to in every single class. It's really up to them. The right to speak up for their needs, and also the right to submit a grievance. So if you are interacting with students in this world and they feel like they're not being met based on what is expected of the institution of higher ed, they can submit a grievance and say, hey, I think I need more support, and just talk through that process. There typically is an internal grievance process, and then there's also an external grievance process if you want to go a little bit higher. But then in addition to those rights, students have responsibilities too. So they're going to be expected to follow the code of conduct as any other student. They have to meet the essential functions of their courses, and they're going to be graded according to that. And then they also have to provide updated accommodation letters to their professors. So like I mentioned before, things don't just carry over without the student presenting it. They have to provide that accommodation letter each semester. And then on the flip side, faculty and staff also have rights in this situation. So they have the right to receive an accommodation letter before implementing accommodations, which goes back to the important piece of starting the process early. They have the right to discuss accommodations with the student while making sure to respect their privacy. They should only be providing the accommodations that are approved on the letter. And then they can contact disability services if they feel like accommodations are altering the expectations of their course assignments. And then they also have the right to grade fairly based on the expectations that they have for every student in their class. And then their responsibilities are to implement those approved accommodations, to make sure that they're putting those in place during their class, and also to maintain confidentiality. So it should not be widespread that students with accommodations in a particular college class, their peers should not know of that. Confidentiality is a high priority. So some of the differences that I'm sure you guys are already kind of gleaning from this, of coming from high school and going into disability services at the college level. High school is under the law of IDEA, whereas college is under that ADA and 504 that I mentioned. High school traditionally offers accommodations and modifications provided by the IEP team, where at the college level, with disability services only, students only have access to accommodations, and they have to request those from disability services. High school has lots of structure. College has a lot less structure and way more downtime. High school, unfortunately, and maybe not all the time, that has less student choice, where at the college level, it's very student driven. High school students have specialized instruction to help them meet academic expectations, whereas at the college level, it's on students to be able to access support services like tutoring or the writing center. Parents are the primary advocate or the primary form of communication in high school, whereas at college, that shifts heavily to the students. So the student becomes their own advocate, and then no conversations about the student happens without the student. So all communication is going to funnel through the students before, if ever, it gets to parents. And that's a pretty big shift for families. What I will point out is that students, when they go to disability services offices, they can complete a release of information form to say, yeah, I'm okay with you contacting my parents if they have questions or things like that. But if a student does not provide a release of information, then institutions, disability services will not communicate with parents about accommodations. So that's something to talk about with your students early on, just to make sure that they have an awareness of. So real quick, as we're talking about what are the accommodations that would be provided, and again, this is all going to be in contrast to what inclusive higher education offers. Accommodations with disability services do not alter what a student is learning. Instead, they're altering how that learning happens or how they're showing that that learning has happened. And really what we're looking for when students are in disability services offices and receiving accommodations is not to limit support to them, but accommodations are a way for them to be prepared for workforce expectations, right? If they're getting into a job, we can't limit what the job expectations are. Instead, they're going to have to navigate ways to meet those expectations in a unique format. So it's really to help them build up some of that professionalism and those skills in their future. But here are just some common examples of what we're seeing at the college level of accommodations. So for classroom accommodations, students can have access to a note taker. That could be the use of a recording device or maybe a peer taking notes, assistive technology, so reading aloud textbooks, things like that. Alternate form of textbooks, audio, large print, braille. So all of those are expectations for any student to take notes, to participate in reading, but students with an accommodation would be able to have an additional format or a different format to do that. With testing, very common to see extended time, quiet testing environments, and even text to speech where it reads test questions aloud. And then with housing, students can access having an emotional support animal, maybe a single room accommodation, or if there's some medical needs, students can work with disability services to determine approval of a personal care attendant. Institutions of higher education cannot provide personal care attendants. That would have to be something that's hired and provided by the student, but they can work out an approval process to have them in housing as needed. So that's disability services. So that's before we get into inclusive services for students with more intensive needs at the college level. But I'm curious if you guys have questions about disability services in general. You're welcome to throw those in the chat or unmute yourself as well. All righty, then we'll keep chugging. Okay, so now we want to talk through inclusive higher education programs. These are those beyond compliance, beyond what is expected of all institutions. This is specifically serving students that would not meet college entry criteria. So it's only offered at select institutions, and I'll show you in just a couple slides which ones are here in Colorado. But I encourage you to access Think College if you're looking elsewhere across the nation. Think College has a large map of all the inclusive programs that are offered across the US. Within inclusive services, there's always going to be a program-specific staff. So I mentioned with disability services, it might just be a couple personnel or it might be a whole office. With inclusive services, it's often going to be their own independent office with a group of staff that are supporting students holistically. Inclusive services offer an alternative acceptance or admission criteria. So students don't have to take an SAT, ACT exam or have that GPA or even have a traditional diploma. Through inclusive services, students can be admitted through an alternative route. And then as they're being admitted through inclusive service programs, they then become an admitted student of the institution. So it's kind of a way to skirt around those expectations. So these are going to be students that don't meet traditional entry criteria. And primarily that means that we're working with students with intellectual or developmental disabilities. That's not an end-all be-all diagnosis. We realize that there's lots of gray area of diagnoses in this world. So essentially, we're looking at students who prove need for additional support in order to fully access college. And I'll share a bit more about that. Students within inclusive services, they have access to accommodations like what we just talked about, but they also have continued access to modifications. And we'll go through some examples there as well. Because of those modifications, because students will be able to change or alter some of the expectations of their courses, they can't receive that same degree that the rest of their peers are with those higher level expectations. So instead, students in inclusive services are pursuing a certificate credential. It's still accredited by the institution. They still have a transcript and are graded and maintain high expectations in a lot of ways. But that's something important to note with these two differences, that students that want to pursue an associate's degree or higher should go that disability services route. But students who want to utilize inclusive services will be receiving a certificate. As I mentioned, it's graded, there's a transcript. Here in Colorado, we don't have students auditing. So that might be a common practice across the nation, that students receiving these services would just sit in on a class and audit. But we really want students to be fully engaged in their courses. And so there's no auditing, they're graded, they're held to high standards. They're fully included in courses that are in line with their job goal. And so I say this in particular so that we do not think that inclusive services on college campuses are like a special education classroom. Inclusive higher education programs are fully inclusive, where students are in traditional classes, fully supported and included. They will receive some direct instruction and some additional support, but we want it to be as normal or normative as possible. And then they're going to get additional support. So this is really where these inclusive higher education programs meet additional needs. They're going to offer support from staff or peer mentors in 4 domains. So this is our image of the 4 domains of inclusive higher education. It's the academics, social, career, and independence. So there's some notes in here that we'll touch a bit more on as we go forward, but inclusive higher education programs are making sure to support students additionally with their academics, how they're engaging in classes, the modifications that they use, their social life, how they're participating across campus, career development, how are they building skills for a meaningful job in their future, and then also independence. So the 4 schools that offer inclusive higher education programs in Colorado are on the screen. So we've got Elevate, which is our community college program in Littleton, Colorado at Arapahoe Community College. They're a 3-year program, which is a little bit more traditional for a community college to be a shorter program than the universities. Then UCCS, we have the Office of Inclusive Services, and that's in the Springs. This is a 4-year program that does have on-campus apartments where students are living with peers from the program and also with neurotypical peers from the campus. UNC, their program is Goal in Greeley, Colorado, also a 4-year program. And they have on-campus dorms as well, where they start their first couple of years living with peers from the program on a traditional dorm floor. And then after their sophomore year, if they want to continue moving forward in their growth of independence, they can live with neurotypical peers as well. And then Regis just started this fall, so they're new and growing. Their programs offer a 1-year track or a 2-year track. They do have on-campus dorms. They had, I believe, 1 student living on campus this past year. And yeah, their track is a little bit different, as it's not like a traditional 4-year program that our other universities have. But with all of these, what we love to note is that they've all received what we call CTP status, which means that they've met a long list of expectations to show that they're inclusive and that they're helping students develop meaningful skills for their future. And therefore, students enrolled in these programs can access financial aid. So students will be able to access federal grants and federal work study if they're enrolled in these programs. Because they're receiving a modified certificate, they do not have access to federal loans at this point, but still there's a lot of money that can get chipped away at with grants and work study. And then all of them are pursuing a certificate that is transferable across program. So we call this the Comprehensive Higher Education Certificate, and students determine their own area of study, and then they can transfer it across these programs as they see fit. So we've had a couple students go to Elevated ACC, and then transfer over to UNC, which is a pretty natural process for students at the community college level. And that's been really exciting to see. So let's talk a little bit. I'm going to try to parallel the topics that we went through with disability services. I'm going to parallel that here with inclusive higher education services. So some of this might be repetitive, but we'll just go through it quickly. Students, in order to be admitted, need to have an intellectual disability or prove need for additional supports for access. So each school is going to have a slightly different expectation there. I would encourage you to reach out to program staff and have specific questions as you need to. But for the most part, they're going to be looking at the IEP narrative and educational history of a student. So it's not just a blank diagnosis that they're going to be looking at. They're going to read through what is the background of this student? What did they need in K-12? And is inclusive services what they need now? So it's very interactive in how they look at documentation. They're going to want to know that the students have desire to go to college. This population of students with intellectual disabilities historically have not had access to college. And so a lot of times we've seen some family members that are really excited about that option, and it's them really motivating that trajectory. And a lot of times that dwindles out their motivation, the student motivation. We really want to see students desire to go to classes, to learn new skills, and to be prepared for a future job. They're going to have to identify their need for modifications in order to access that college content. There is going to be an uptick expectation of independence, that they would be able to participate in a college course and maybe in a lecture hall with support as needed, but would be able to participate in that way. They're going to be held to the code of conduct as any other student would be. And we really want to make sure that they understand that they're pursuing a certificate credential. That doesn't get them that bachelor's degree, but it allows them to say, here are the key classes that I took and the key skills that I developed over my time during college. And that they want to also participate in vocational training, because that's a big part of these programs. So application process for inclusive higher education, because it's an alternative admission process, it's also an alternative application process. So don't go to Arapahoe Community College website and just apply randomly. You want to go to the Elevate at Arapahoe Community website so that you can apply to that program in particular. All of these programs that I showed you earlier, they have an online application. They tend to open and are due around the winter time, and then interviews begin in the spring. So those are really starting to wrap up here as the spring wraps up. Part of the application process for inclusive services is that students would answer basic questions, that even parents or caretakers would also provide some input about student needs, history of educational support, things like that. A lot of times they're going to ask for letters of recommendation from previous teachers to say, would this student be a good fit for this program? And then they're going to ask for that disability documentation. And ultimately, all of those programs have some level of interview, whether it's virtual or in person, and or an on-campus experience where students can get a feel for, is this the place that I want to be? So once students are in these programs, what does it look like? What are those supports that are put in place? So a lot of our programs have an orientation process where students and their families come a bit early so that they can engage a bit more with the campus, get to know key staff around campus, and just have their bearings set a bit more. So that tends to happen earlier on. But then once they start their program, students are going to have a person-centered planning session with their program staff. They're going to talk about their career goal. They're going to determine what their area of study is. What are the appropriate courses that they need to take at this level? And then also they're going to coordinate. So program staff is going to help coordinate peer mentor support and a recommended schedule for their day. So maybe it's having peers meet with them before and after classes to help them preview and review for their content. Or maybe it's scheduling a peer mentor to go with them to some of the classes that they take. So the coordinator or program staff will help navigate that. They'll also talk about when's a good time to attend social events and structure that for them, and then discuss housing as well. And then just like you would with the disability services, students within inclusive services are going to have an interactive process to talk about what are the modifications and accommodations that you would need to be able to access all of your courses. And then they're also going to get access to a specialized course, which is where Program staff speak a little bit more directly to financial literacy, some independent living skills, general job training skills, things like that, where it could be direct instruction to them in addition to the inclusive classes that they take. So of those 4 pillars that I mentioned, let's just kind of hit on what are the supports available through these inclusive higher education programs. They will be able to access the full course catalog, meaning they can select classes that any other student can select, as long as it falls in line with their career goal and really makes sense for them in terms of skill development. They're going to take those courses for credit. They're going to receive that comprehensive certificate. A lot of times what we're seeing is students take 2 traditional courses and then that 1 specialized course each semester. Inclusive Services also offers study halls for students to come and meet with peer mentors and get some questions asked and answered. And then they also promote students to go to other campus supports, so the tutoring center and the writing center, to get all the support that they possibly can. This is a little bit tricky to see, but I wanted to give you guys an example of a certificate. So when we're looking at these certificates, it's kind of like a bachelor's degree, just really shrunk down, where there's some prescribed courses that are just prerequisites, what we expect all students to take. And then there's choices for them to select classes in their area of study. So this is from Elevate at ACC, where you'll see basic college composition reading, intro to PC applications, but then in each semester, they get to choose a class from the catalog that fits their area of study. So within that certificate, they're able to access modifications. So we mentioned what accommodations look like, but now at this level, what do the modifications look like? So this is where students can have alterations to what they're learning. So no longer do we just have to shift how they're learning at the same level as the rest of their peers, but we can alter what they're learning. So that means that expectations of the course can be adapted to meet their cognitive level. This is going to be coordinated by the program staff. So we're not expecting college faculty and professors to know how to modify. Even though they're going to be notified about a student with modifications, the program staff coordinates that by looking at the syllabus and through assignments, and they make those modifications to meet the student level. So common examples that we see, and this is all very variable, so it's going to be unique to each student. But at the classroom modification level, a lot of times we see a limited length of assignment. So instead of a 5-page paper, maybe we have a student working really hard on 1 page or really hard on 1 paragraph. A lot of times we have students using graphic organizers if they are at this point unable to complete a full paragraph or in written form, they can do it in visual form, showing what they've learned, how they've progressed. In testing, students might have fewer questions for exams, maybe simplified wording for exams, and then even an alternate format. So instead of taking an exam, maybe they can submit a video describing what they've learned. And then for housing, some of the modifications that we see are just having additional staff or RA support come in pretty consistently to support students in how to take out the trash, and are they following up on daily chores with their roommates, things like that. So modifications are really such a pivotal part of inclusive higher education. If students require modifications to access this information, then inclusive higher ed is where they want to go. So this is just a quick picture of an example. This is one of many modifications that have been provided to our students. So up at the top, this is from Arapahoe Community College, one of their intro reading courses. Up at the top are 2 approved modifications. So one is that a student can use a main idea or graphic organizer. And then the other one is that they have a lessened length of assignment. So what the professor or the program coordinator did was take this assignment, whereas all other students maybe answer 2 of the 3 questions, this student's only going to answer 1, and they're going to be able to provide their response in a graphic organizer. So they're still getting the same content and the same assignments, so to speak, as the rest of their peers. And then the program staff are going to come and alter those assignment expectations to meet their need. And then they submit it like any other student on their platform, and they get graded like any other student, but it's based on the modified expectation. So I put this in here hopefully as an example that we still want to hold students to high standards, even with these modifications at the college level. We really believe that students can continue growing academically. And so there might be a fading of these types of supports. Maybe we would move the student up to answering in a paragraph format instead of a graphic organizer. At the social level, the supports that inclusive higher ed offers is helping. There's going to be a campus engagement staff or somebody that helps communicate what's going on across campus. How can you get involved? And then they'll be able to offer peer mentor support to guide that. And then they really promote natural supports through clubs and just typical peers asking for help traditionally. And these programs are going to be guided through career development as well. So we're looking at the first year or two really exploring what their desires are, what their goals are, what their strengths are, and talking about some skill development. Then moving into job shadows and practicums. And then years 3 and 4, students in these programs are getting internships, paid on campus or paid off campus employment. So this is a quick picture of some of our students that have gone through inclusive higher education programs, receiving that certificate credential, and what are their outcomes? What have they actually received in terms of a career afterwards? So we've got a student who currently is a full-time paraeducator in Grand Junction, which has been wonderful, administrative assistants, graphic designers, teacher assistants. So we've really just seen a large increase in job diversity from students that are pursuing inclusive higher ed. And then at the independent level, they're able to develop self-advocacy in so many ways. When you're fully included on college campuses, you're going to be challenged to be your own self-advocate. But these programs will also work with students to develop just general life skills, relationship management, public transportation, things like that, as well as living on campus and some of those strategies. So some important things to note on this side of things is that even with modifications and even with these high level supports, inclusive higher education programs still have an increased responsibility for the student more than they had experienced likely in their K-12 time. It's very student driven. We want the student to determine what they want to study, what they want to do, what classes they want to take. High expectations are really important. And I mentioned this earlier, but we really want to be fading some of the supports from our students. So by the time that they graduate, we feel really confident about what they're able to accomplish outside of the university or the college. Just as I encourage you to start your process with disability services early on, start looking into inclusive higher education early on if this is where your student or students would fit. So that's an overview of inclusive higher education. We did disability. I'm curious, or disability services, are there any questions about how those two differ? Anything that I can clarify? Awesome. Jean, I'm glad that these slides are helpful. I'm going to be sending them your way, so hopefully you can continue leaning into them if you ever have follow-up questions. So with those differences, kind of comparing disability services and inclusive higher education services, I also want to talk about how are they going to be similar? And the best way to do that is that I want to point to that students in either of those categories are still going to be highly encouraged to utilize campus resources. So these are going to be resources that are shared with these students, no matter which bucket they fall into. So these are just common examples of what we encourage our students to participate in. So yeah, at the top, you'll see whether your student receives disability services or is enrolled in inclusive services, they have access to all of this. So going to meet with an academic advisor. At the inclusive higher education level, they can go schedule a meeting with an academic advisor and then bring maybe a peer mentor or a program staff with them to help understand what they're looking at or to help advocate for them. They can meet with career services, talk about job options in the community, financial aid office meetings, tutoring center, writing center, library and research center, Greek life, all of these things. So I want to just make sure that we're not assuming disability services or inclusive higher education services are their own silos on campuses. We really want students to use those as their primary form of support and then be empowered to go out to access all other supports across campus. That's really when we see students thrive, where they feel the most included and it's the most natural process for them. So with this, if you are interested or if the students that you serve are working towards inclusive higher education, I just encourage you to talk with them, talk with program staff early on about how they're connecting across campus. We don't want to be recreating special education separated classrooms on a college campus. So we encourage, and we see this really strongly with our community college model, But we encourage students to know the staff members in disability services. We encourage them to meet with police across campus so that they know the supports that they have, mental health supports on campus. So it's good to start even now at the K-12 level to help your students see who outside of the special education team are you connected with on campus? How are you getting supports naturally? And that's really what we want to see for our inclusive higher education programs as well. So the big question, if you're thinking about a particular student or students that you serve, is where do they fit? Which one is going to be best for them? Do I want to have them continue on to get a degree and pursue disability services, or do I think that they need additional support and should pursue this certificate credential? So this is just kind of an example to help you think of who's a good student in your mind that might fit into this bucket. So for disability services, you can think of maybe a student who started on an IEP, but then transitioned to a 504 plan junior year or high school, or senior year of high school, where they kind of transitioned into a little bit more general education coursework, things like that. Maybe they have a visual impairment, so they require Braille materials or some assistive technology to help them access information. They also use exam accommodations, reader scribe, additional time, but they've been included for the large majority of their K-12 time in general classes, and they're following that general education curriculum. And maybe they want to become a teacher for a visually impaired person. So this particular student, you can see that the needs of that student would be met by accommodations at the Disability Services Office. And also their career goal, being a teacher, is going to require a bachelor's degree. So you know that if that's the goal, then we want to send them towards that degree seeking route, which would be disability services. And identifying that the supports that they received would all be able to be available at the college level. On the flip side, students that might fit best in inclusive services, a student that probably had an IEP all throughout K-12. Maybe it's somebody that has Down syndrome. That's kind of a common disability diagnosis that we can wrap our heads around. But their curriculum was largely accessed in a special education classroom, or maybe even a severe sports needs classroom. Their IEP talks about lots of supports in a variety of things, not just academic supports, but also social skills and communication supports. Maybe they're not writing at the high school level. They are likely eligible for transition services. And right now, they are likely not going to be able to meet college entry criteria, but they want to learn some business strategies and be a part of a local business, and then eventually live independently. This student, so in order to be in business and the business world, it's not required that they would have to have a bachelor's degree. So they could take some really tangible skills and move that into their job goal, but they also might need modifications at the college level. So this student is going to fit more into that inclusive higher education world. I will say that we've had students kind of fluctuate across these worlds. We've had a student at ACC that started with inclusive higher education, built up some skills and said, I feel ready to try this out without modifications. Transitioned over to just disability services, and she just graduated this May from CSU. So that is absolutely an option. But by and large, we're seeing students that are admitted to these programs, inclusive higher education programs, having a high need for that modification. And then I also get to hear a lot about, well, what about the gray area, or those students that you know that might fit right somewhere in the middle, that you think that they're able to pursue a traditional degree, but maybe they need additional supports. So this is kind of an example of some gray area programs. These are not available at all institutions. Sometimes they fluctuate a whole lot in terms of what they offer, but I do want to give a picture of some what I call supplemental services to disability services. So this is for students that still would be admitted traditionally to their college. They want to receive a degree, so they're going to be associate's degree seeking or higher. They would only require accommodations because these programs can't provide modifications. And a lot of times we're looking at students that are independent, academically able to meet expectations at the college level, but need some executive functioning support, things like that. So there's a list of just a few resources. So CSU has a program, DU, MSU has a couple, and then there are a few nonprofits that support students, Untapped Learning and College Learning Experience. So I encourage you, if you feel like your students are more that gray area category, to check out these links when I send you the slides so that you can look into those a bit more. So with my last few minutes, I just want to speak to no matter where your students are going to be landing, if it's disability services or inclusive higher education, we want to be preparing our students with disabilities for high expectations of college. So we talk a lot about presuming competence of our students with disabilities, no matter where they fall on the spectrum of need. We want to presume that they are competent of growth, of learning, and that really changes when we start with that perspective. That changes how we interact with them in goal setting and experiences and encouraging them to pursue bigger dreams. And we've really seen that take place in our students pursuing inclusive higher education. So we encourage that for all students with disabilities. We want to encourage normative pathways, meaning what any other student at their age level would be looking into, i.e. college. We want to help them do that. Give them informed choice, not removing college as an option from a student with a disability, but allowing them to see here are the expectations, here are going to be the challenges and the areas of growth for you so that they can self-select. Do they want to participate in that or not? No matter if they pursue college or not, those are going to be transferable skills that you're helping them develop when you talk about college preparation. And then just really, I hone in on this a whole lot, that high expectations are so valuable and pivotal to the outcomes that we see. So yes, Jean, I love your comment. So this is from a graduate parent from UNC. The student graduated a couple of years ago and now is actually working in the inclusive higher education program staff, helping new freshmen join their program. But she says the bar has been set high and the students have risen and reached it. They've been presumed competent and their lives changed. And that really is what happens when we presume competence of our students. So real quick, I'm going to give you like a really quick view of some academic skills and non-academic skills, but I would point you towards, I have some additional webinars from previously this semester that go into these a little bit more in depth. So know that I'm just going to give you a really quick view and then encourage you to look at other ones. But we want students to continue, no matter what their academic level is, to continue developing basic writing. So maybe that's working on sentence structure. Maybe that's using assistive technology or talking about email etiquette. That's going to help them in college and beyond. Basic reading comprehension, using audiobooks and assistive technology, knowing their learning style and preferences so that they can better engage in information at the college level, and really helping them to explore academic interests. What do they want to learn more about? And then there's a whole list of non-academic skills that also come into play at the college level. Some of the big ones that I want to focus on is just self-awareness, helping students to identify what their disability-related needs are, what are their interests, what are their strengths and weaknesses. Self-advocacy and decision-making, giving them choice on a regular basis so that they're building in that problem-solving skill of making decisions. Self-management, giving them ownership of their schedule, of personal regulation, and then self-determination. How are they setting goals and how are they working on plans or baby steps to reach those goals? And then all in all, we want students to be heavily involved, no matter which route they take. We want them to be involved in the planning process. So asking students with disabilities about their post-secondary goals, asking them about their thoughts on college, having them lead IEPs, using strength-based assessments so that students know these are my strengths and this is what I want to lean into. And then again, giving student choice even now. So helping them select electives, social groups, where they're starting to see this is what I'm interested in and what I would pursue. So I've got some links in here for you guys to learn a little bit more about our inclusive higher education programs, but my background is also in disability services, so I'm happy to answer some of those questions as well. So you can find information on our website. We also have a module, five-part module that you can go through to do a bit of a deeper dive. We've got upcoming webinars and a monthly newsletter. So I'm curious if anybody has any questions for me before I let you go. Wonderful. Well, I will hang tight until 1 o'clock. I promised you guys that time, but I'm going to go ahead and throw in our chat this quick little survey. Would love for you guys to fill that out for me. Just let me know what are the resources you might need. Also, if you're an educator, I can provide a certificate of completion if you want to offer that for additional credit. So Again, I'm Shayna Lang, so grateful for you guys to spend your afternoon with me and learn more about disability services versus inclusive higher ed. Please reach out and let me know how I can help resource you.